Let's talk about an identity column. An identity column is very similar to a default constraint because it's automatically going to provide a value. Now, the way that an identity column is going to work is you're going to provide a seed, a starting value, and then an increment, which is how much it's going to then add to the seed, and then in turn the highest number, and so forth and so on. Now, the big thing to keep in mind about an identity column is that while it will ensure uniqueness, it's not going to guarantee me a sequential number. The reason for this is SQL wants to be as fast as possible. So let's say that I begin a transaction and I go to insert into a table that has an identity column. And then while I'm doing my work, somebody else comes along and they want to insert a brand new value into that table. Now they're probably not going to impact my transaction, so I probably don't have anything locked that's going to impede them from doing that, except for maybe that identity column. So what's going to happen in the case of an identity column is I will get a number for my transaction. The other person will also get a number for their transaction. Now, if my transaction gets rolled back, the number that I'm using is going to get burned. In other words, it's not going to be reused. It's not going to backfill. It's just going to be a gap in the sequence. Now, you're also going to notice that an identity column is not going to be editable by default. Now, if you're doing a bulk load, you do have the ability to specify that you want to do an identity insert, so that way you can maybe pull values from another table. But that is an option that you have to specify. Now, if you're going to be adding an identity column to a new column, this is very easy, simply identity and then the seed and the increment. For an existing column, however, what you'll need to do is actually drop the column and then recreate it. So when I go back over to update my little table here, you're going to notice that there's my customer ID. I'm going to say identity, our seed of 1, our increment of 1. And then I'm going to sneak down here, and again, identity, and 1, 1, just like that. And if I sneak back over to our existing database, scroll up here, what you're going to notice is that, sure enough, we've already got the identity specifications in there, so I don't need to do that. The next type of a constraint that we have is what's known as a check constraint. And what a check constraint allows us to do is ensure that a value is inside of some range or meets some bit of custom validation that we've put inside of there. Now, this is very common in scenarios where I need to ensure that maybe a value is within a particular range, that one column is less than another column, that I need to make sure that if one item is null, that the other item has a value or vice versa, things like that. Now, if I want to add a check constraint to a new column, then what I'm going to do is specify a constraint, give it a name, and the name is extremely important here because, again, that's going to be basically your error message. Check, and then whatever code you're going to use. Now, you'll notice that our check constraints can actually be applied in one of two ways. It could be for an individual column, and this is useful if the syntax that I'm using is only going to use just one column. On the flip side, however, if my code is going to utilize multiple columns, maybe I need to compare a value of one column to another, then I need to specify this at the table level, in which case it's just going to typically be down at the bottom of my create table statement. In the case of altering or adding a constraint, then what you're going to notice is that it's just simply going to be alter table and then add constraint and whatever name it is that you want to give it, and then whatever code it is that you want to specify. The last little thing that I want to mention about a check constraint is that if you're adding this to an existing table, you may have a lot of data that's already in there. So you may decide, maybe because you know that the data is valid, or because you may be looking to just sort of grandfather in any of the existing values, decide to not look at the existing data to see whether or not it meets the check constraint. The way that you do this is by specifying the with no check option. Let's take a look at adding on our check constraints. What I'm going to do is on the existing table, I'm going to add on our constraint. Let me actually put comments in here. There we go. And let's say this is going to be our check constraint. And what I wanted to do is I want to ensure that our order date is less than or equal to our ship date, or that the ship date is null. That basically what I'm trying to simulate is that if the ship date is null, that's telling us the product hasn't been shipped. If the ship date is a value, then it obviously needs to be after or equal to the order date. So I'm going to say alter table, DBO orders, add constraint, and let's say CK, and we'll say orders for the name of the table, and then I'm going to say ship date is null or after order date. And you'll notice that I'm giving it a nice clear name here. Now, one of the other things that I want you to notice is that while it is a very long name, you're really never going to type this in ever again. So don't be afraid to give this a good long name. Now, I'm going to specify check, and then I'm going to put in my logic. I'm going to put this down at the next row here. And let's go ahead and say ship date is null or ship date is greater than equal to order date. And if I highlight that, hit execute, sure enough, that completed successfully. So we're looking good there. I'm going to come back over here to our new table, and I'm going to come right to the end, put in a comma, and I'm going to put in basically the exact same logic. So it'll be constraint, CK, orders, ship date is null or after order date, and we'll say check, and we'll say ship date is null or ship date is greater than equal to my order date. Excellent. Let's talk about our unique constraints. Now, there's actually a couple of different ways that you can set up unique constraints. We're actually going to take a look at one main one in here. But in a nutshell, a unique constraint is going to enforce that every value in that column is unique. Now, you're going to notice that unique constraints and primary keys are very similar because both are going to require unique values. The couple of very big differences between a unique constraint and a primary key is that a unique constraint is allowed a null value, only one, and that I can have multiple unique constraints on a table. I'm only ever allowed one primary key on a table. Now, the other very big thing to keep in mind about a unique constraint is a little side effect. Unique constraints will always create an index. This is a performance optimization. Now, one of the things that we want to ensure is that when we go to modify a value inside of that column, that we can figure out whether or not it's unique as quickly as possible. And the best way to do this is by having an index for that, so that way we can just look inside the index, see if it matches anything, and if it doesn't, then away we go. Now, there's three ways that we can create a unique constraint. One way is by creating the index directly. That's a bit beyond the scope of the course. A second way is just by flagging the column as unique when we create it, just by putting in the keyword unique. I'm not a big fan of that because then I don't get to create the name for that. The last option is to add on the constraint. And so we'll do this by saying column definition, constraint, give it a name, and then the word unique. If we want to add this to an existing table, then again, it's going to be alter table, add constraint, give it a name, unique, and then specify the column that we want to make unique. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure that every customer's email address is unique. So let's go ahead and just simply say constraint, and I'm going to use AK for alternate key, which is, again, just a convention. I'm going to say customers, and I'm going to say email address. Now, you're going to notice here that I'm not going to add to the name that it's unique. And the reason for that is because AK will automatically imply that. And then I'm going to say unique. And now we've made that column unique. Going back to our existing database, I'm going to say alter table, DBO customers. Let's make sure I've got a dot there. And I'm going to say add constraints, AK, customers, email. Is it email or email address? There we go, email address. I have a great memory. It's just really short. Email address and unique. And then the column, which in our case will be email address. And once again, we'll highlight that, execute that, that completed successfully.